So with no further ado, State Senator Barrack Obama.
Thank you, Ward. Good afternoon, everybody. I am very happy to be here. You know that I think this stuff's important because I'm here during election season. How many voters in the 13th legislative district? I know KO, we got one. Now I have two. There you go. Okay, so I got to be trolling for votes a little bit while we're here. Actually, I teach at the University of Chicago Law School, and there's a common adage that we transmit to law students in their first year, and that is the saying that process is substance. Process is substance, and the reason we try to emphasize that in law school is because I think a lot of law students come in and they think, well, there are these rules about the law on the one hand, and then there's the substantive issues and ethics and morality and public policy questions that is really the interesting stuff, and we learn the rules just so that we can get to that interesting stuff. And any of you who practice law or operate in a legal setting or a legislative setting very quickly begin to understand that, in fact, process dictates substance to a large degree. And so what I'd like to do is very briefly just start off by talking about what I see as the biggest challenge in policy making in the 21st century, and that I think is a process question. Who is making policy, and how is policy being made? And that is an inherently political question. And I'm raising that not because it's political season, not only because I'm electioneering, but because I actually am deeply disturbed by the disconnect between policy making that takes place in Springfield, and certainly that disconnect is probably even greater in Washington, and the population, how they experience the policy problems that many of you spend the time to look into, research, and advocate for. It's currently estimated that I think in this upcoming election, turnout will be somewhere around 25% of registered voters. That means approximately 1/8 of eligible voters, maybe a little higher or a little lower than that, depending on the location. Because of that voter disinterest, there is very little policy making that takes place in Springfield that is subject to consistent, ongoing, thoughtful public debate. In fact, the rules and the processes that are set forth in Springfield are primarily designed to constrict debate as much as possible and to localize the decision-making power in as few hands as possible. As a consequence, there are a whole host of policy issues that are of deep interest to the folks you represent and advocate for, are of deep interest to you as citizens that have no chance of seeing the light of day in Springfield or in Washington. The vast majority of Americans would like to see serious gun control. It does not pass. Why does it not pass? It doesn't pass because there is this huge disconnect between what people think and what legislators think and are willing to act upon. Healthcare. We've got, in the midst of the greatest economic boom in my lifetime, and probably most of yours, we have actually record numbers of persons with no health insurance. And yet, there is virtually no movement around the issue of how do we provide insurance to these uninsured. There's a lot of talk about HMO reform, and which looks good, partly because it doesn't cost that much. It's a matter of just passing a couple of laws. I support this HMO reform, but it certainly doesn't get at the more fundamental issue of what we do with this burgeoning number of people who have no health insurance and are one illness away from bankruptcy or worse. So one of the most important policy questions that I guess I want initially to put forward and I don't have all the answers to this, is how in fact do you re-engage the population in this civic process? How do you re-engage people in questions of policy that affect them, and how do you make them feel that they actually have some significant power over these issues? And the reason I think I want to raise that first is because the people who are guilty of disempowering the population are not only the bad guys. I won't be partisan here and say who the bad guys are. It's not only the folks who are representing the special interests, quote unquote, and the guys with the pinky, diamond rings and the fat cats. Sometimes it's also us. Sometimes it's the experts or the advocates who are not that much better at advocating on behalf of and with the communities that they purport to represent. So that the lobbyists down in Springfield who represent a whole host of good causes that I strongly believe in, oftentimes have very few troops behind them, have not engaged in conversation with the very communities that they're representing. And the legislators are aware of that. And to the extent that they are able to move legislation through Springfield, it's because they are savvy lobbyists in the same fashion that the beer distributors have savvy lobbyists, or the real estate folks have savvy lobbyists. But generally they lose because they have less money and less resources. And if they were going to win on these policy debates, it would take more than simply being armed with good facts and making good presentations. It would also have to do with the fact that they had mobilized a constituency around these policy questions. And so I think a starting point for us to think about these issues in the 21st century is how do we think about some of the systemic changes that might be required to re-engage the citizenry in these policy issues. And I would have some suggestions that I'll be happy to toss out during the question and answer, things like public financing for campaigns, how do we strengthen mediating institutions like churches, unions, community organizations, and provide them with the resources and access to decision making. So I'll have some suggestions, but I also think that we probably need to think about our own practices internally, and who it is that we're directing our message to when we conduct policy research. I'll just give you an example that is a critique of lawyers, so I can do it without hopefully offending too many folks around here. We had a major policy debate around juvenile justice issues in this past legislative session. And the policy was clearly on the side of people who did not want to see a ratcheting up of penalties for juveniles and an increased number of juveniles being sent to adult prison. The research was there. We had there were studies that showed that recidivism rates were actually higher for juveniles who were tried as adults as opposed to stayed in the juvenile system. There were studies that showed that the investment in prevention dollars and programming would actually have a more salutary effect on the crime rates than some of the punitive measures that were being proposed. Nevertheless, the state attorneys and the prosecutors moved forward on their proposal. And I kept on asking the advocates and the lawyers, who were doing an excellent job presenting the problem, have we gone to the communities that might be affected and talked to them and convinced and persuaded people in their hearts and minds, and not just out in the suburbs, but in the inner city where folks feel crime most acutely? Have we persuaded those people that in fact we shouldn't just lock up these 15, 16-year-old thugs who are hanging out on the street corner and threatening the little ladies? And the answer was we had. Well, have we come up with alternatives that we can package and sell to the population so that we change the terms of the public debate so that we're actually advocating to the public as opposed to just the legislators? Well, no, we hadn't really done that. And as a consequence, the bill that was proposed by prosecutors sailed through in the Senate. I think it was 57-2. Despite the fact that policy research was argued against the bill, because we hadn't done the kind of work that we had done. I don't want to take up too much more time, so let me just move to, I guess, what technically is substance, but is still an issue of process. What I think will re-engage people in politics is if we're doing significant, serious policy work around what I will label the working poor, although my definition of the working poor is not simply folks making minimum wage, but it's also families of four who are making $30,000 a year. They are struggling. And to the extent that we are doing research figuring out what kinds of government action would successfully make their lives better, we are then putting together a potential majority coalition to move those agendas forward. One of the good things about welfare reform, which the 1996 legislation I did not entirely agree with and probably would have voted against at the federal level, but one good thing that comes out of it is that it essentially desegregates the welfare population, which presumably is black and undeserving and urban, versus the working poor, which are the other people. Now you just have one batch of folks who are working but don't have health insurance, aren't making much money, can't figure out daycare, don't spend an hour and a half trying to commute to the jobs that do exist, don't have much opportunity for enhancing their skills so that they could actually move up into an income bracket that would support a family. That is increasingly a majority population. And so to the extent that we have policy systems that are thinking about how do we provide effective health care to those populations, how do we provide job training so that people can upgrade their skills when they're in these jobs, how do we provide effective child care, and of course, how do we educate the children in these families in such a way that they are able to access economic opportunity. I think those are going to be the critical policy questions that we face in the coming century. And I don't think, by the way, that that is just a problem for urban areas or the inner city or particular populations. I think that cuts across issues of race and geography, and as a consequence becomes a useful means for coupling policy with politics. I think that the wonderful work that Ori and many of you do in the areas of diversity is absolutely vital, and there's some significant policy questions around housing and desegregation that have been intractable but have to be addressed. Nevertheless, I am actually a strong believer that if we organize policy around issues of economics that diverse populations have in common, we will have the basis and the conversation will have taken place and the coalitions will have been formed around which we can address some of the issues that Ori has so effectively organized. And just to give you an example, I went to an Indian organization dinner, service organization dinner last night, and I was told that within the Indian community, you're seeing a significant departure from what used to be the so-called model minority that was coming over, and they were all professionals and moving out to Hinsdale or wherever these places are. I don't mean to sound ignorant. I know where they are, but she pointed out that actually the new immigrant population is much less skilled, is much more apt to be in this category of working poor that we talked about. Is having the same problems that folks who've been here for a while are already having. And what that means is that gives us an opportunity then to do some organizing that we couldn't do before. Let me just close by saying, as we think about the policy research surrounding the issues that I just named, policy research for the working poor, broadly defined, I think that what we're going to have to do is somehow resuscitate the notion that government action can be effective at all. There has been a systematic I don't think it's too strong to call it a propaganda campaign against the possibility of government action and its efficacy. And I think some of it has been deserved. Chicago Housing Authority has not been a model of good policy making, and neither necessarily have been the Chicago Public Schools. What that means then is that as we try to necessitate this notion that we're all in this thing together, leave nobody behind, we do have to be innovative in thinking what are the delivery systems that are actually effective and meet people where they live. And my suggestion, I guess, would be that the trick, this is one of the few areas where I think there are technical issues that have to be dealt with as opposed to just political issues. I think the trick is figuring out how do we structure government systems that pool resources and hence facilitate some redistribution, because I actually believe in redistribution, at least at a certain level, to make sure that everybody's got a shot. How do we pool resources at the same time as we decentralize delivery systems in ways that both foster competition, can work in the marketplace, and can foster innovation at a local level and can be tailored to particular communities. And so just a quick example of that would be the difference between Chicago public housing and building Robert Taylor versus low-income tax credits that are being provided to community development corporations to build scattered site, low-rise housing in mixed-income communities. So I think that's the direction that we're going to need to move in on a whole host of issues. I think I went over time. I apologize. Never let a politician start.
Okay, my name is Rodrigo Lightfoot, and I'm from Engle Industrial Retention and Growth Organization, and my question is for Senator Obama. When we came to Northern Trust to talk about the TIFs, this is an important issue in our community. We have several important issues and legislative initiatives, and the biggest problem is, number one, getting people to turn out, two, getting people to understand the issues, and finally get them to debate about it. Would you come to that, please?
With respect specifically to the TIF legislation, I remember this was a 6th Ward meeting, and there were a number of people who were concerned about redevelopment of the area, and I think it's a good example of the disconnect that I was talking about earlier. I think a lot of us in the room as advocates are very aware of both the promise and potential abuses of TIFs, and it's been debated widely and discussed. But if you ask the average person in the neighborhoods that are being TIF'd, what is a TIF? Folks don't have a clue. And so I think that we have to come up, the onus is on both community organizations and elected officials to make a concerted effort to inform people about the basic choices and decisions that are being made that affect them. Now, as Carlos pointed out, unfortunately, a lot of elected officials have no interest in broadening the conversation or the discussion, particularly when an issue like TIFs may invite controversy and flack and so forth. And that is why it is absolutely vital that there are a set of community organizations in place that can not only be reactive to, say, a proposed TIF, but are also proactive in saying, hey, this TIF stuff looks pretty good if it is being driven by the community and a community planning process that determines how it might be utilized. And so, I don't mind plugging the organization Carlos is working with, the United Power and Justice in Action, right? I think
Power for Action.
Power, yeah, right. There you go. See, if we're going to plug it, let's get it right. But I think it's that kind of community organizing model that ends up being absolutely vital to connecting policy with actual implementation and empowering citizenry to make these decisions. And the advantage of organizing as a model, particularly institutional-based organizing, church-based organizing, incorporating unions in the organizing process, is that it's hard for a small block club to be an expert on all the issues that might affect that block. It's hard even for a organization, let's say in Inglewood, to be an expert on all the complex issues that Paul raised about workforce preparation. Both for reasons of political power, but also for reasons of resources and expertise. I think the potential for regional organizations that have a variety of components, political organizing, potentially direct service provision, potentially communication strategies and media strategies that are all combined in empowering those local areas, I think is going to be absolutely vital. So I hope that answered your question. I'll be happy to expand on it personally.
My question is sort of how we can, as policymakers, as researchers, as people who live in communities and who are trying to be engaged in this, whether there are specific steps that can be taken in order to sort of do what in other places is called social economic initiatives, or bring about sustainable economies, bring about positive change, linking research in a way that does give us this sense of accountability and having community development. It's a big question, but I mean, it sort of ties into our
All of them over again.
I'll get things started by just saying I think you answered your own question. You described exactly what you need to do, and so then it's a matter of doing it. We didn't say that there aren't roadblocks to making it happen, but I think that let's take a concrete example. You've got a community. There's its location is attractive enough that there's potential for gentrification. Let's say there's a hypothetical Latino community, which already has its own housing problems, but also has a very vibrant, rich, and strong set of associations, whether those are parishes or merchant associations or whatever. Well, if there is a catalyst or an organizer to get those parishes and merchants and other folks in the community to sit at a table and say, change is coming. How do we steer this change as opposed to letting it roll over us? That strikes me as the most important step. Once you get to that step, then there are a whole host of technical questions. Then there are issues of, well, can we call up some academics to help us do some surveys or research about this stuff, or can we canvass other communities that have already undergone this and negotiated it successfully, and how do we get some powerful allies, and let's meet with the aldermen, and let's, right? So then there are a whole set of strategies and tactics surrounding moving forward at that point. But the initial task is to get the relevant players around the table in crafting the common vision that Carlos talked about. And I think that not just as an elected official, but with my sort of philanthropic hat on as a trustee, that's a process that at least, let's say, the Woods Foundation, where Woods Fund of Chicago, we're very interested in funding. And I think that the challenge for a lot of you as researchers and policy advocates is to be creative in terms of how you work with these folks once they're at the table. I mean, not trying to simply import or transplant your latest idea. I don't mean to be dismissive. I'm sure these ideas are good ideas.
Well, sometimes the problem is precisely if you're representing getting enough marginal voices out. And if you're requesting funding, not just doing research as a hobby initiative, you also have to play into the numbers game in a way. To get funded, you have to sort of show that you were successful, and how is success evaluated sometimes isn't always done in the long term. Like the way of creating an alternate vision isn't normally done in a year or in 3 weeks of an interview. So this is a bigger question of, even running our own vision of accountability towards social change, towards positive initiatives.
I agree that the process doesn't happen fast, and sometimes foundations and government is generally done in terms of wanting to see immediate success. Now, the flip side of that is I think there are also organizations that never move beyond marginality. And at some point, you got to say, well, this hasn't taken. We need to shift resources somewhere else.
I'm sorry, say your question.
My question is, can you your organization support research that is not necessarily partisan, but is laid down like it is, attacks the players as they present themselves? How do you
All around.
Sure. I think documenting the facts, public debate is what policy analysis is all about.
Well, I think Paul addressed the sometimes difficult task that foundations have. We've got a law on the books, the IRS laws, that say that public foundations are not supposed to be engaging in political work. And since my view is that most of this stuff that we care about is political, it's a matter of line drawing on the part of foundations. Part of the frustration I often have also as a trustee on a couple of foundations is that there are a number of foundations that hold diametrically opposite views to mine that are extraordinarily aggressive in the political arena and are willing to fund advocacy that I think steps over the line. You know, if you were actually looking at the IRS regulations of what they're doing, but are able to get away with it. And so there's not always a level playing field, and I think that that often disadvantages funding the kinds of coupling of advocacy and policy making and communications and media strategies that would be effective in moving an agenda forward in this society. But I think what I've seen in the foundation community is an increasing commitment and increasing understanding that unless you fund advocacy and sophisticated advocacy with some bite to it, that's not partisan but nevertheless has some bite to it and lays out the facts. I think foundations recognize that that's needed if we're going to make changes on the kinds of agendas that Paul discussed. But I think more work needs to be done. I think foundations are still a little bit shy, and I think that's a mistake.
My question is to the panel from a foundation legislative perspective is, what do you guys know about what's happening in the community and large society in terms of the way technology is impacting the society? And how does your knowledge inform what you do legislatively and granting? I mean, there's some issues like the Telecom Act. I know we got $400 million going to the university for technology. I did talk to Drew right the other day. He said that you're going to be looking at communication as part of grant and he knows that has an impact and importance of technology. I just like to get a sense of where you guys are on that, because I think that's an issue that can have some real impact in some of these things we talk about in terms of community coming in power and so on.
Well, if you're asking me, like, how successfully I surf the web, not very successful. I mean, so you're asking me about my personal competence with respect to the technology, then I think I'll avoid that question. If you're talking to me about the recognition, I think that this is an important issue, and that it's an important issue not only because it's creating new mechanisms of conversation, and as a consequence, new forms of community that have to be tapped into if we're going to engage in this one. I think legislators are very aware of that. I think legislators are also keenly aware of its increasing importance in education, not just K through 12, but lifelong learning. I think there is a great deal of awareness of that. And I think, finally, there is some awareness among certain legislators of the critical issue of access and the potential technology gap that tracks all the other gaps that exist in the society. So I think that there's a lot of understanding of it, that these are important issues. Now, what I don't think exists right now is a thoughtful strategy or planning approach that could be presented to legislators with respect to technology and how this impacts a particular arena. So let me give you an example. Probably the most obvious one is computers in the classroom. I think you talk to any legislator and they'll say, you know, I want computers in my classroom and my district classroom. Well, what are the computers going to do? Are the teachers being trained to teach with these computers as opposed to these computers basically just flashing up the same stuff that used to be on mimeograph sheets, right? So it's not any more creative than it was, and in fact ends up just being a waste of money and time. How is this incorporated into the pedagogy of the school system to open up new avenues of learning? That kind of systematic thinking about these issues has not been done. And I think there's a tremendous amount of room and opportunity for not only foundations but also the state to take on that task. The problem when you talk about legislators, and this is where foundations and advocacy organizations really fill the gap, it is extraordinarily difficult because of the tremendous demands on dollars, you know, now for stuff that folks want now, and they know they want. They want their pay raise. You know, Medicaid payments have to be met. You know, there's a shortage in the pension fund. That education funding we're looking at, we just need to hire more teachers. You have a constant talk about being reactive. I mean, if you think advocates are reactive, you know, if you look in the dictionary under reactive, you see, you know, the General Assembly or Congress, because you're constantly being confronted with all these demands that already exist, and it becomes very difficult to plan for the future and anticipate these future needs and to fund these future needs. And so this is where the initial groundwork of coming up with plans on a whole host of these technology issues probably is going to need to be done in the advocacy community, and it's an important set of aspect of policy work that will trigger, hopefully, and provide models for the legislature to then fund once we know, all right, this is what needs to be done, or this is what works, or at least this is an experiment worthy of state funding. And the state's always conservative, even the liberals are conservative about funding experiments, and so you need to kind of get it going outside of the state.
Hail Satan!
Hail Satan!
Satan is his father, and his name is Adrian. He shall overthrow the mighty and lay waste their temples. He shall redeem the despised and wreak vengeance in the name of the burned and the tortured. Hail Adrian! Hail Adrian! Hail Satan! Hail Satan!